I was kidnapped. The kidnappers told me to hurry up and get in the car. I nodded and asked, I get carsick, can I sit in front? Can we pass other cars? Can I eat? Can I sit by the window? The kidnappers were silent for a moment, then said, you can get out of the car now. No sooner had I gotten out of the kidnappers' car than I ran into the police who were chasing them. The cop looked a little familiar. Oh, it was my unlucky ex-boyfriend, Mark. We caught all the human traffickers, and we found all the girls. Their families have been notified and will come to pick them up soon, it's just. The young officer stopped mid-sentence and looked back at me. This madam said her husband's phone isn't reachable and asked if her son could pick her up. As soon as he finished speaking, a spark of fire in the corner was extinguished, and a man who had been refusing to come out slowly walked forward. Half of his exquisite profile was hidden in the light, and he slowly asked, Winter, you're married? I stayed squatting, chuckling, married? Honey, I've already finished my postpartum confinement, and my second kid is 8 years old. Mark was silent for a long time, and I don't know if he believed me, but he looked away and said calmly, call your husband and have him pick you up. I said impatiently, I already told you, he's on a business trip. No problem, you can just stay at the police station then. I'll stay with you. He emphasized I'll stay with you heavily. I flinched and quickly grabbed the phone he handed me. He held on to the other end of the phone, not letting go. I looked up at him. He stared into my eyes and said slowly, call him while I'm watching. Mark and I used to date. I know what a jerk he can be better than anyone. I gritted my teeth, took his phone, and dialed my best friend's burner number. Before she could speak, I started, hello? Where are you? What? Business meeting? Are you serious? Leaving me alone in the sticks to herd sheep? Before I could finish, Mark snatched the phone away. He listened to my best friends yelling on the other end while watching my expression. Seeing my face turn all sorts of colors, he hung up, satisfied. I was embarrassed and wanted to argue, but Mark cut me off. He nodded towards the young officer, you can go. I'll take her later. The young officer looked at me, then at him, and hesitated, so, Captain, you're Winters? Mark smiled, and he looked pretty good doing it, me? He glanced at me, I'm her kept man. The young officer's face was shocked. Sitting in the passenger seat of Mark's car, I still wouldn't give up fiddling with my phone. I checked my horoscope and my star chart. Why didn't anyone tell me today was bad luck for everything? First, I got kidnapped, then I ran into my ex-boyfriend. And he was the ex-boyfriend I dumped. What was the reason I broke up with him back then? Oh, right. We're both type B blood, and I was afraid we'd have a 2B kid. Wait. Where's my half-baked cheesecake? My half-baked cheesecake? Who took my half-baked cheesecake? That culprit, where are you? I was still searching for my half-baked cheesecake. The driver's door opened. Mark stood there, holding a bag of mini cakes, looking at me coldly. Our eyes met, and I whispered tentatively, for me? Shocking. My ex-boyfriend, who I broke up with 5 years ago, actually bought me mini cakes. Is it old feelings? Or is the flame rekindling? There's only one truth. And that is, I don't believe it. He tossed the bag into my hands, got in the car, and buckled his seatbelt. After thinking for a moment, he added, the one you bought yourself is no good anymore. I nodded. He was silent for a while, then suddenly leaned in close to me. As his breath got closer, I froze. Finally, his breath stopped right in front of me. I instinctively half closed my eyes. After a long silence, I heard him chuckle, then he said in a low, lazy voice, haven't washed your hair in 3 days, have you? He got this close just to see if I'd washed my hair? Blushing with indignation, I opened my eyes. He buckled my seatbelt for me and leaned back. He then asked, where do you live? Where do I live? When I heard that, my whole body tensed up, and I looked at him warily. Why was he asking where I lived? The old grudges from 5 years ago hadn't been fully resolved, and I just ducked out. Now that we'd met again after 5 years, Mark is extremely petty, so he'd definitely want to settle the score. I gripped my seatbelt and started spouting nonsense. Unit 3, Tranquil Gardens. Mark raised an eyebrow at that. Which apartment? I pursed my lips. 702. To be safe, I added, I live with my dad. Mark nodded, chuckled softly, and said calmly, okay. Okay? What okay? 5 minutes later, when Mark and I stood together at the door of 702, Unit 3, Tranquil Gardens, I suddenly understood what his okay meant. Mark lit a cigarette and leaned casually against the wall, motioning for me to open the door. What? Didn't bring your keys? I stuck my neck out and said, yeah, that's right, what about it? Mark didn't change his posture. Knock on the door. Isn't your dad home? I twisted the corner of my clothes and said again, at this time, he might. Mark walked straight over and knocked hard twice on the door. The door opened, and a little kid, about 5 feet tall, looked at us with wide, puzzled eyes. Our eyes met, and I quickly rushed forward, affectionately taking the little boy's hand. Dad! You took a bath while Mom and I were out again, didn't you? You've shrunk yourself, look. The child was startled. He pouted, tears welling up, and said, Auntie, who are you? Oh, so pitiful, so cute, and I felt so guilty. So why did he call me Auntie? Do I look like an auntie? Mark put out his cigarette, strode over, and ruffled the child's hair. Good boy, Auntie's a little crazy, don't mind her. Go back inside now, and next time, don't open the door for strangers. The child nodded obediently. Okay, big brother. Calling him big brother and calling me auntie. The child dutifully closed the door, and Mark turned back, glancing lightly at me. Winter, do you think this is funny? I looked into his eyes, not knowing what to say for a moment. He chuckled, lit another cigarette, and said, You don't still think I have lingering feelings for you, do you? Those silly things from a few years ago, do you really think I'd still be hung up on them? You don't think I'd keep pestering you, do you? Am I that shameless? I lowered my head, my eyes stung, and my hands clenched tightly behind my back, digging into my palms to keep the tears from falling. Before I could speak, Mark spoke again. You thought right. Winter, I am that shameless. I thought I misheard. What did you say? He wouldn't say more, turned, and went downstairs. House on fire, I take pictures, life's a mess, I sleep. So after parting ways with Mark, I slept happily for a whole day. Speaking of Mark in my past, it goes back to our parents. My dad was my Mark's mom's rival. Yes, exactly what you're thinking. The kind of rival who loved but couldn't have. And so, my dad put on a one-man show of love turning to hate, then back to love, then hate, then love again. Which is to say, Mark's mom never cared about him. Then my dad grit his teeth and adopted me, raising me with great difficulty. I heard my dad's initial intention was to use me to get back at Auntie. But as he raised me, he got addicted to it, holding me so carefully, as if I'd break or melt. Later, when he took me to meet Mark, he was even afraid Mark would snatch me away. After all, Mark was a handsome kid from a young age, and he could recite multiplication tables at 5, while I was still wetting the bed at 5. Even though I knew nothing about studying, I was lustful from a young age, especially when I saw cute kids. I wanted to immediately go up and bite them a couple of times. That's what I thought, and that's what I did. So the first time I met Mark, I bit his fair and tender neck. They say it left a scar, but I've never seen it, and Mark won't show me. He actually used to be pretty good to me. We were young sweethearts. The first time I got my period, he was the one who, blushing, went to buy me pads. Later, because I secretly read my dad's diary, the strong feelings for Auntie in the diary made teenage me actually think Auntie was my mother, and Mark and I were siblings. What a mess. I ran away from Mark. For a long time after that, whenever I read those cheesy novels about lovers turning into siblings, I would cry uncontrollably. Others were reading fiction, but I was looking in a mirror. I was still reminiscing when I got a call from my best friend, who said she was drunk at a bar and asked me to pick her up. I walked in and immediately ran straight into Mark, who was leading a raid. It was the first time I got to seriously observe him in his police uniform. And you know what, you really can't deny it. He did look pretty handsome. I stared at him. My best friend whispered in my ear, "That guy I just added on Messenger, the one named Leo, he just texted me asking if you're going tomorrow. He probably has a crush on you." Just as I was about to ask who Leo was, I saw Mark slowly walking over in my peripheral vision. He walked over, said something into his walkie-talkie, but his eyes were fixed on my dress. I felt awkward under his gaze and quietly said, "Oh, what a coincidence. Have you eaten?" Mark looked away, his tone cool. "I don't know, why don't you ask Leo if he's eaten?" My best friend tugged my sleeve. "Ask him when we can leave?" I swallowed. Officer Mark, when can we leave?" Mark continued to be sarcastic. "Did Leo tell you to leave?" Seeing me silent, Mark lowered his head and glanced at me, his tone strange. "What?" "Say a few things about Leo, and you're already upset?" I looked up at him and said indignantly, "What's wrong? Can't I have a temper? Have you ever seen a rose without thorns?" This time, it was Mark's turn to be speechless. My best friend rubbed her eyes, realized who it was, and immediately pulled me, screaming, He, Mark?" I didn't say anything, and my best friend continued, "Hey. Your ex-boyfriend. Remember him? Your childhood sweetheart. Back then, when you were drunk, you kept pulling him and calling him a battalion commander, and you even insisted on buying him an Italian cannon to propose with. That's weird, how could you forget something so embarrassing?" "Oh, right, what was the reason you broke up with him back then?" "What was it?" Before she could finish, Mark's gaze suddenly sharpened, and he said coolly, "She was afraid of having a to-be kid." My heart sank, and I quickly covered my best friend's mouth, whispering furiously in her ear, "Shut up." We stayed at the police station until the middle of the night before Mark finally let me go. I was already drowsy and about to fall, so I quickly answered the young officer's questions and turned to leave, bumping right into someone who was entering the door. Before I could react, a hand landed on the back of my head, and with a gentle press, I was pulled into his arms. The police uniform fabric was a little stiff, and a pleasant scent filled my nostrils. After a moment of silence, a slightly hoarse voice above me said, "Winter, why are you throwing yourself at me?" I realized it was Mark, and my face flushed red. I pushed him away. Sorry. I didn't dare look up, rushing out with my head down. As I reached the door, I heard Mark softly swear. Then, the young officer exclaimed in surprise, "Boss. Why are your ears so red?" I glanced back quickly and saw Mark squatting on the ground, his ears bright red. Ugh, he really hasn't changed at all after all these years. Just a hug, and he's this shy? Mark, whatever, of course I won't sleep all night when I hug the person I like. What good person goes to the police station twice in 2 days? Of course, besides me. I'm a good person. My dad never found me a stepmom so he could raise me successfully. From a young age, Auntie treated me like her own daughter. As soon as the news of my return broke, Auntie immediately messaged me on social media, asking where I was staying. I hesitated for a moment, then sent her my address, carefully asking her not to tell Mark. Auntie sent a string of voice messages. "Little Winter, don't you trust your auntie? Auntie's lips are sealed. Really? You can rest easy. Auntie will bring you some delicious food another day." I replied, "Thanks, Auntie." In the afternoon, I went out to grab some takeout. As soon as I opened the door, I saw Mark holding takeout and opening the door to the apartment across the hall, then calmly walking in. I must be blind, definitely. I was still thinking about how much of a blabbermouth Auntie was. Then, I looked through the peephole and saw a girl knocking on Mark's door. From the moment the first woman entered Mark's apartment, I started watching like a detective, squatting by my door. When the sixth woman went in, I closed my eyes tightly. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I walked back to the kitchen. The dumplings I ordered earlier were already cold. I opened the container and put the dumplings in a pot. Suddenly, I remembered I didn't have any vinegar, so I thought I should borrow some from next door. I knocked on Mark's door. He opened it quickly, blocking the doorway, looking down at me without any surprise. What is it? I tried to peer inside, but he was too tall, so I could only see a few pairs of feet under his armpit. Mark saw I wasn't speaking and asked again, seriously, what is it? I snapped out of it and stammered, I'm eating dumplings, and I don't have any vinegar at home, so I came to borrow some. He nodded, scrutinized me for a long time, then agreed, wait a moment. After saying that, he turned to leave, then remembered something and pulled the door shut so I couldn't see inside. He came out quickly, handed me the vinegar, and was about to close the door. I froze, then quickly said, could I also borrow a little soy sauce? He frowned slightly, said nothing, nodded, turned, and closed the door again to get the soy sauce. Darn it, after all that effort, I still didn't see anything. Mark brought out the soy sauce and handed it to me, eager to close the door. My free hand quickly pressed against the doorframe. Could I also borrow a little sesame oil? Mark raised an eyebrow slightly, was silent for a moment, then nodded softly. He brought the sesame oil, but didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, he leaned against the door, looking at me playfully. Winter, what else do you need to borrow? You're not going to borrow dumplings too, are you? I nodded, then quickly shook my head. I really don't have any dumplings at home. Damn it, I was so flustered, my tongue got tied. Mark placed the sesame oil in my hand, looked down, and met my gaze. Winter, what do you really want? Mark's eyes were incredibly beautiful. I swallowed and looked away, whispering, I remember there was a handsome guy living across from me before, who knew it'd turn out to be you. I came to hit on the handsome guy. Mark's eyebrows immediately furrowed, and he laughed coldly twice, saying ominously, handsome guy? Hitting on him? Winter, I underestimated you. I stuck my neck out, about to argue a couple more points, but he ignored me and slammed the door shut. The wind from the door blew in my face, and I instinctively closed my eyes. Before I could even open them, the door opened again. Mark looked at me with a cold expression, then snatched the vinegar, soy sauce, and sesame oil from my arms and slammed the door shut again. I thought about it, then stood on tiptoes and leaned against the door, planning to peek through the peephole. I didn't see anything, but then the door was suddenly pulled open. I lost my balance and fell with a clatter, landing flat on the floor, my knees numb. I looked up, and inside the room, 4 men and 6 women were all looking at me with various expressions. I swallowed and tentatively opened my mouth, trembling. So, I made a complete fool of myself, then slunk back home. Before I left, Mark stared at me and suddenly said, Winter, I finally get it. I stopped in my tracks. Get what? He crossed his arms and slowly said, it seems you really. I instinctively held my breath, looking at him seriously. It seems you really want to eat dumplings. I stormed off, but I didn't expect Mark to actually bring me dumplings that night. It was late when the dumplings arrived. He knocked twice, didn't even wait for me to open the door, left the food, and then left. Judging by the dumplings, they seemed to be from Auntie. Besides the dumplings, Mark also lined up the vinegar, soy sauce, and sesame oil by my door, from tallest to shortest, like a military drill. There was also a note attached to the insulated lunchbox, simply saying colleague. Actually, I knew all along, I wasn't jealous at all. Mark has been very busy these past few days, always leaving early and coming back late. Sometimes he comes home with colleagues, sometimes alone, I don't know what he's busy with. I was sitting cross-legged on the sofa watching TV when someone knocked on the door. I glanced at the clock, 8:30 p.m. Since it's winter, it was already completely dark outside. I hadn't ordered takeout, so who could it be at this hour? I hesitated for a moment, then stood up to open the door. The door hadn't fully opened yet when I saw a glinting fruit knife. Immediately after, the door was kicked open, revealing half a face hidden behind it. I looked up, and by the light in the hallway, I saw the person standing at the door. The man was short and dark, holding a knife, and he swore as he rushed in. "You bitch. You got my big brother locked up. I'm gonna kill you today to avenge him." Turns out, he was an accomplice of the human trafficker who hadn't been caught yet. In the blink of an eye, he darted into the room, knife in hand, and lunged at me menacingly. 5 minutes later, Mark burst into my apartment, out of breath. I was squatting on the sofa, munching on sunflower seeds. The heavy-set man was tied up with a bedsheet on the floor, his face flushed dark red, his expression contorted as he glared at me, cursing, "Stinky bye." Before he could finish, I slapped him on his shiny bald head. He winced in pain, tears streaming down his face, and under my cold gaze, he changed his words, "Please, please don't do that to me." The police officers who followed Mark in stared in disbelief at the scene before them, and someone in the crowd quietly muttered, "Holy cow, that's awesome." Everyone reacted, praising my fighting skills, with compliments and admiration rising and falling. Mark stood ramrod straight at the very front, silently glancing at the heavy-set man on the ground, then walked straight towards me. "Winter, are you hurt?" I tried to stand up from the sofa, but I'd been squatting too long and couldn't get up. Instead, my hand slipped, and I dropped my phone on the floor. The phone was still lit up. Mark only glanced down, and his expression suddenly changed. Because Mark's expression changed, his team members all crowded closer to look. Mark blocked their view, picked up the phone, and held the screen towards me, saying with a half-smile, "Winter, you need to explain this." I stared with wide eyes. Oh, snap. My phone wasn't locked. The search page was right there on the screen. It was stopped exactly on the big words, "How to subtly win back an ex-boyfriend." Well, darn it. Yes, that's right. My goal in coming back was Mark. Especially after I found out he didn't have a girlfriend and no one he liked. My goal became even clearer and more defined. Except for the first time I was kidnapped, which was an accident, everything else was intentional. But I also have to thank that kidnapping incident. Although it wasn't the grand entrance I imagined, it confirmed something for me. This guy, I could charm him senseless in a minute. Later, picking up my best friend was actually because I knew he was on a mission there beforehand. And when I told Auntie where I lived, I knew that big mouth Auntie couldn't keep a secret. So yeah, it was all premeditated, I did it on purpose. Everyone had left. For a moment, it was just Mark and me in the room. Mark sat on the sofa, glaring at me with a cold face. I asked him, "Are you happy?" Mark immediately denied it. "It was all as I expected, what's there to be happy about? I already saw you were still hung up on me, you know, I'm not that happy." I nodded, looking him directly in the eyes, "Oh." He got uncomfortable under my gaze, stood up to leave, and said as he walked, "Who cares, who's happy, not me, I have something to do, I'm leaving." I watched his retreating back and said, "Mark." His tone was bad, "What do you want?" "The door's over there." His back froze for a moment. Realizing he'd walked the wrong way, he sighed in annoyance, rubbing his forehead, then turned and strode out. He walked to the door, then came back and said, "I'll give you an answer tomorrow morning." "Winter, what answer?" "Did I ask any questions?" "Mark, my wife chased me, my wife chased me, my wife chased me." The next morning, he indeed came to give me his answer. Mark's skin was very fair, and standing in front of him, I clearly saw the dark circles under his eyes. He stood blocking my door and said seriously, "I agree to get back together with you, but you have a 2-month trial period." I stared into his eyes, frowned slightly, and before I could speak, he immediately added, "No? 1 month. Is 1 month okay?" I said, "You first." "Still no?" 2 weeks, Winter, I can't go any lower than that." I stood on tiptoes and patted his shoulder, "I know you're in a hurry, but don't rush, please move aside, I need to get my takeout." Mark froze for a moment, then looked back and saw the impatient delivery person who had been waiting for a long time behind him. I took the takeout from the delivery person. Sorry. The delivery person cursed as he walked downstairs, already annoyed starting work in the morning. Looking at the takeout in my hand and the cursing delivery person walking downstairs. Mark opened his mouth, his tone calm. I'm going to work now. I made way for him, watching his retreating figure as he walked downstairs, and shouted, 2 weeks, okay? Don't back out. Mark's steps faltered for a moment, then he still said calmly, Still pretty calm. I turned to go back inside. The next second, I saw Mark trip over his own feet and fall down the stairs. He's a cop, all right. In just 15 seconds, he quickly got up and rushed out of the building entrance. Watching him flee in disarray, I couldn't help but burst out laughing. The first step to being a good girlfriend is, of course, to bring your boyfriend a loving lunch. I had just appeared at the police station entrance with my insulated lunchbox when that young officer with sharp eyes spotted me. Winter, are you here to bring our boss lunch? I grinned and frankly admitted, yeah. The young officer nodded inside. Boss and Chief Smith are talking in the office. You can wait here for a bit. I nodded, okay, thanks. As soon as I sat down, the young officer immediately leaned over and asked with a grin, Winter, are you and our boss together? I nodded again. How did you know? The young officer sat down next to me and whispered, how else would we know? Our boss said so himself. Oh. What did he say? He said you chased him. That's it? That's it. I was so done. The young officer saw I wasn't speaking and added, Winter, you're really brave. So many people like the boss, and none of them ever get a good word from him. You just quietly put him in your pocket. Awesome. Truly awesome. I smiled modestly. It's all right. The young officer looked around and, finding no one, lowered his voice again. Winter, you don't know, that day you accidentally bumped into the boss at the police station. He seemed calm on the surface, but actually, he was so excited he couldn't sleep all night. And today he came in with such huge dark circles under his eyes, he probably couldn't sleep from excitement last night again. Leo. Before the young officer could finish, he heard someone call his name and immediately fell silent, turning around. I followed Leo's gaze and saw Mark standing ramrod straight at the doorway, his gaze cold, sweeping over both of us. I grabbed my insulated lunchbox and zipped over to him, looking up obediently. Your girlfriend who chased you is here to bring you lunch. Mark's ears did indeed turn slightly red. Finally, he coughed twice and said, mind your surroundings. Pfft, repressed. Mark saw I wasn't speaking, pursed his lips, and was silent for a moment, then whispered, so what did you bring? Dog poop. In a way, my dad and Mark's dad were rivals in love. And our two families were neighbors. So, even when the two old men were watering flowers on their balconies, they'd still bicker. On my first day at my new job, I went home. It just so happened I caught them yelling at each other on the balcony. From whose flowers bloomed better to whose cactus had more thorns. Auntie saw my car enter the complex from afar and didn't even let me go home. She dragged me to her place. As soon as we were inside, Auntie pulled me into a room and got straight to the point. Auntie heard you two got back together? I nodded, yes, Auntie. Auntie happily patted my hand, then sternly said, but, little Winter, Auntie remembers you were the one who dumped Mark back then. I froze, quickly about to apologize. Auntie, Winter, you know, Auntie and Uncle only have this one son, and he's so excellent. He's never faced any setbacks, but because of you, that boy really suffered. I pursed my lips and said nothing. Auntie continued, however, that brat likes you, and he only wants to be with you, so what can we, as parents, say? It's just, my heart isn't completely at ease, unless... I looked up at her. She leaned closer to me and said secretively, that brat said you were the one who actively pursued him this time. How did you do it? Spill the details. Auntie saw I wasn't speaking and anxiously patted my hand. Tell me, and Auntie will forgive you. When I left my parents' house, it was already past 5 p.m., and I had planned to go back to my rented apartment. But as soon as I got in the car, I received a message on social media from Leo. He had secretly recorded Mark. Mark was wearing his black police uniform, likely on a mission, closing in. The camera then panned to the woman in front of Mark. The woman was looking down, shyly. Mark, being 6'2", made the woman seem incredibly petite. I put down my car keys and turned up the volume on my phone. The woman softly said, "Officer Mark, I'm so cold, can I borrow your jacket?" Mark had his back to the woman, holding his walkie-talkie. He turned his head slightly to look at the woman, his gaze distant and unfamiliar. After 10 seconds of observation, he calmly picked up his walkie-talkie and said, "Lucy, bring over one of your jackets, someone here is cold." Lucy, who was also a woman, quickly brought her jacket and draped it over the woman after hearing Mark. The woman put on the jacket, bit her lip, and looked at Mark again. "Officer Mark, can you take me home later?" Mark didn't answer, just glanced indifferently at Lucy. Lucy quickly said, "Miss, don't worry, someone will specifically take you home." The woman was silent for a moment, still staring intently at Mark. "Oh, okay, then, Officer Mark, can I add you on Messenger?" Mark turned around, looked at the woman with a cold, unemotional gaze, then looked away and said blandly, "No, I have a girlfriend. Even though my girlfriend is very generous, I can't take advantage of her generosity." The woman froze, then her face flushed crimson, and she stammered, Sorry." The video ended. I turned my phone upright. Leo then said, "Boss is awesome, practically the head of the Good Boyfriend Club." I smiled and replied, "Where are you guys on assignment?" Leo quickly sent a location, "We're getting off work soon. The deputy captain will take the people back, and then we're going out for dinner." I put my phone away and started the car. "Mark, Leo, have I ever told you that you're not allowed to use your phone during work hours?" Leo's hand trembled, and Mark took his phone. "Confiscated." Before Leo could explain, Mark had already looked down at the screen. "Winter." He skimmed through it. Mark cleared his throat, put the phone back in Leo's hand, and said seriously, "Don't let it happen again." Leo couldn't stop smiling and eagerly leaned in again. "So, boss, can I still record?" Mark looked straight ahead and said calmly, "Make me look handsome." How awkward. When I arrived at their dinner spot, Mark was squatting on the steps outside, smoking. The streetlights were dim and yellow. He had just gotten off work and seemed a little tired. His face was obscured by the swirling smoke, making him seem very lonely. I wasn't wearing heels, so I quickly ran towards him. Hearing my footsteps, Mark looked up, his eyes lit up when he saw me, then he quickly put out his cigarette and stood up to greet me. I rushed into his arms. He stood steadily. I looked up at him. "Were you waiting for me?" Mark met my gaze for a moment, then looked away. I thought he would deny it, but he didn't. "Yes, are you cold?" I shook my head, hugging him tightly. "Oh, his waist, hey, he seems to have more abs than before." Mark closed his eyes tightly, took a deep breath, and gently kissed my forehead. "Let's go, let's head inside." After playing games and drinking quite a bit with Leo and the others, I couldn't walk in a straight line when Mark took me out. He was driving, so he hadn't had any alcohol from the start. As soon as we got in the car, I suddenly remembered what Auntie had told me. The more I thought about it, the sadder I got. I tugged on Mark's sleeve, snotty and tearful. "Mark, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have changed my college major without saying anything back then. I shouldn't have left you, I'm sorry, you suffered so much." Auntie said if she hadn't stopped him, you would have become a monk or a eunuch. "I'm so sorry." Mark held my head, afraid I'd hit it on the car window. Listening to this, I don't know if it was the alcohol, but I thought I saw his mouth twitch. "My mom told you that?" I nodded woozily, my mind still somewhat clear. Was Auntie lying to me? I knew it, Auntie just loves exaggerating things. Mark pursed his lips, as if making a decision, and looked me in the eyes seriously. My mom was telling the truth. I got even sadder. I hugged his arm, sobbing breathlessly. I'll never leave you again, even if you die. I'll be your widow. I'll agree to anything you say. Skipping everything before, Mark directly caught the last sentence and asked me, anything I say, you'll agree? I nodded. Mark gently squeezed my chin, then, now, can I kiss you? My brain suddenly short-circuited. Mark wasn't originally asking for my permission. By the time I came to my senses, he had already kissed me until I was breathless. I couldn't even open my eyes. I just felt that Mark tonight was somehow different from usual. I was very close to him. The fine, wispy hairs on his forehead lay softly against his fair skin, and the eyes beneath his hair were dark and bright. I swallowed, wanting to speak, but he leaned in and pecked me again. I was stiff all over, afraid to move. Mark realized this, chuckled softly twice, very alluringly. I drank too much, way too much. It must be. The car lights weren't on, and my head was spinning. I couldn't even see his face clearly. Even though I couldn't see his face, I could feel his breath right next to me. I was still holding his hand. The car was very quiet. I swallowed and quietly called his name, Mark. He looked at me. I called out again, Mark. Mark. I'm here, Winter, I'm right here. I was a little sleepy and wanted to close my eyes. Before I could even close them, he leaned in and kissed me again. Winter, do you want to marry me? I felt like I sobered up and suddenly opened my eyes wide. As I opened my eyes wide, I saw his collarbone revealed by his partially unbuttoned shirt. So beautiful, I thought. I was still spaced out, and he leaned over and gently kissed me again, asking after each kiss. Do you want to? Do you want to get married? Do you want to marry me? Winter, do you want to? Yes, 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 yes. Lust overcame reason. I answered him, yes. After answering, I suddenly remembered something else. Wait, aren't there still 2 weeks of probation before I can become permanent? He stopped kissing me, buckled my seatbelt for me, stared into my eyes, and said frankly, the probation period thing was something I thought of the day we reunited. Marrying you wasn't. The car started. He looked straight ahead. After a while, I heard him say again, I decided to marry you when I was 18. I was stunned for a long time before leaning closer to him and saying, Mark, I don't believe you. Alcohol really does cause trouble. The next morning, before I was even fully awake, I heard someone talking in the living room. I sat up and checked my phone. It was only 8:30 a.m. I thought someone had broken into the house, so I put on my coat and got out of bed. As soon as I stood up, my bedroom door was pushed open, and Mark, still holding his phone, greeted me, awake? I froze for a moment. Everything from last night flooded into my mind. I seemed to have agreed to marry him. I freaked out. Before I could finish freaking out, Mark strode over, stopped in front of me, bent down to meet my gaze. I might have to leave. I subconsciously followed his lead. Is something wrong? Mark nodded. I guessed, going out on a mission? Mark said, yes, I need to go to Yunnan to assist with a case. They specifically requested me. When will you be back? Maybe a month, maybe 2. I can't say for sure. I pursed my lips. Can I call you? Mark gently shook his head. Wait for my call. I didn't say anything more. Okay, I'll wait for you to come back. Don't get hurt. Hearing this, Mark raised his eyebrows slightly, and a faint smile flickered in his eyes. Not running away? I shook my head. No, I'm not running away. Really not running? Really not. Mark's hand at his side rubbed twice. He probably wanted a cigarette. After a moment's thought, he raised his hand towards me. Winter, want a hug? I slipped into his arms, following his arm. Yes, I want a hug, and a kiss too. Mark left that afternoon. I stood on the balcony, watching him get into the car, and then didn't hear from him for 2 whole weeks. This day, as I was leaving work, I saw 2 people pulling and tugging at a girl. I dropped my bag. As soon as I stepped forward, the three of them turned into a group. Before I passed out, I was thinking. Darn it, don't use tranquilizers. I'll tie all three of you up and beat you. When I woke up again, a gun was pressed against my temple. In front of me was a camera, and standing there were one man and three women. The man said to the woman leading them, "You guys keep an eye on her, the police are getting close, she's very useful to us." The woman gripped the gun in her hand, pointed it at my head, and nodded seriously. The man went downstairs. I looked up at the camera in front of me, then at the woman. "Where is this?" The woman shouted, "No talking." I raised an eyebrow and remained silent. At night, the woman who spoke during the day came to bring me food. The other two women were playing cards nearby. The dinner wasn't very good. I ate a couple of bites and couldn't eat anymore. The woman feeding me looked me up and down and said mockingly, "A spoiled rich girl like you wouldn't be used to our food, and don't blame us, blame your man, who told him to be a cop." I nodded, my attention on the two women playing cards. I watched as the woman played all her good cards, and I got anxious. "Seriously, sis, are you an idiot? Why aren't you playing your airplane with wings combo? Oh my god, you're killing me, such a good hand played so terribly." The woman feeding me frowned and also looked at the two women with me. I was frantic. "You're killing me, what kind of game are you playing? I'm so done, you didn't play the little joker, you didn't. Aren't you keeping track of cards? Is your brain filled with like 2 ounces of water?" The woman turned to look at me. "You're good at cards?" I chuckled softly. "Not bad, everyone calls me the god of gamblers." The woman didn't seem to understand, but her ears perked up at the words god of gamblers. After a moment of silence, she said, "Let's go over there, you play with us." I narrowed my eyes. Wouldn't that be awkward? The woman who had been serving food shook her head. "Anna, no." Anna stood up and walked towards me. "What's awkward about it? Don't say there are 3 of us now, even if it's just me, I can subdue her, she looks so delicate." The woman untied me, and the next second the rope was around her neck. The woman serving food shrieked, but it was too late. The 2 of them were tied up by me. I turned to look at the woman still sitting on the ground, who was pointing a gun at me and pulling the trigger several times, but the gun didn't fire. I walked towards her, snatched her gun in a few quick moves, pointed it at her head, and said word by word, "Sweetie, the gun isn't loaded." The woman was terrified and stammered, "Don't kill me, don't kill me." Of course, I couldn't kill her. I originally wanted to scare her a bit, but then the walkie-talkie she had thrown aside buzzed. "Anna, Anna. The police are here. Turn on the camera. Quick." I turned around and saw the camera. 3 minutes later, the camera was turned on. The man chuckled sinisterly. "Captain Mark, either let me go, or wait for me to collect your woman's corpse." After saying that, the man turned around and froze. His 3 subordinates were tied up, and I was casually leaning back, crossing my legs. Our eyes met, and I couldn't help but whisper, "So many people." When they closed in, Mark stood at the very back of the crowd, helmetless, his eyes fixed on me, dark with concern. I opened my mouth to greet him. "Hi." He suddenly rushed forward, gripped my wrist, and pulled me into his arms. He was trembling all over, and shaking violently. I gently patted his shoulder to comfort him. "See, I'm fine, aren't I? Don't be scared, don't be scared." I don't know how long passed before he asked me in a hoarse voice, "Are you mad at me?" I froze, then laughed. "Mad or not, what? Are you going to break up with me and set me free?" Mark gritted his teeth and replied, "Dream on." Later, Leo secretly told me that when everyone found out I was captured, they all thought Mark would go crazy. Even Chief Smith came to ask if he was okay. Surprisingly, Mark was remarkably calm, like a different person. One of us was inside, and one was outside. I knew he would come, and he knew I could save myself. There was no communication, just a deep trust in each other. I nodded slightly when I heard this. Okay, at this moment, in this situation, I have to admit that the 5 years we were apart really made me regret it. After returning from Yunnan, everything settled down. Auntie, all by herself, out-argued the two old men and set the wedding date for 2 months later. The two old men couldn't win against Auntie, so they cursed at each other, arguing wildly in the living room, completely out of control. I went to the kitchen to get some water and passed by the study, hearing Mark and his mom talking. Mark said, "Winter wanted to reel me in, I saw it coming a mile away." Mark's mom chuckled and said, "You saw it coming?" "I saw it coming a long time ago." "Then what were you planning to do about it?" Mark laughed softly. "I wasn't planning on doing anything, just how to get hooked." I froze for a long time, the hot water in my hand grew cold. That night, we each went home. In the middle of the night, Mark suddenly knocked on my door, saying his water heater was broken and he wanted to shower. I didn't think much of it. When I was showering, Mark suddenly started banging frantically on the door. "Winter, the power's out. The power's out. The power's out." I jumped, looked at the dazzling bathroom light, then realized what was happening and immediately cursed, "Mark, are you trying to kill me?" It went quiet outside. After a while, the bathroom light suddenly went out. I froze, quickly wrapped myself in my bathrobe, and walked out. "Mark. Mark. The power really is out." I looked up and saw him sitting cross-legged under the circuit breaker, smiling triumphantly. I immediately flared up. "Mark. Are you insane?" He raised his hand and flipped the circuit breaker. All the lights in the living room came on. I instinctively pulled my bathrobe tighter, suppressing my anger. "What exactly do you want?" He reached out to me, seemingly pouting. "My legs are numb, I need you to hold my hand to get up." I couldn't be bothered with him, then die there. I turned to leave, but he suddenly got up behind me and rushed forward quickly. I instinctively shrieked as he picked me up. "Mark. You scared me to death." He chuckled softly without speaking, carried me to the bed, set me down, and then said, "Winter, I'll sing for you." My heart was pounding, and I said irritably, "Why? Don't you dare sing horribly to kill me and then claim to be a widower." He chuckled softly for a while, not listening to me, burrowing into the crook of my neck, and softly humming. "And how you got me blind is still a mystery. I can't get you out of my head. Don't care what is written in your history. As long as you're here with me." Mark's voice was clean and pleasant, and he sang gently. I leaned on his shoulder, a little dazed. He ruffled my hair, leaned down, and kissed me. "Winter, do you know?" He kissed my forehead. "In all these years, every single day, I've missed you so much." He kissed the corner of my mouth, then moved down, adding in a muffled voice, "Luckily you knew to come back." I instinctively turned my head and immediately saw the scar on his neck. That was from when I was 5. It really did leave a scar. Mark heard me laugh, looked up, and asked, "What are you laughing about?" I shook my head. He squeezed my waist, leaned in a little closer, and didn't press me. "Baby, it's okay if you don't say it now, I'll always make you say it." "Mark, you jerk." Epilogue. The lights overhead flickered on and off, and my best friend and Leo sang an old song up front. I leaned in Mark's arms, playing Snake. His free hand ruffled my hair, having a great time. My best friend got tired of singing, turned around to drink water, and casually talked to me. My attention was on the game, so I just answered whatever she asked, until I didn't even know what I was saying. It wasn't until Leo burst out laughing that I snapped back and realized I had accidentally blurted out the misunderstanding I had back then, thinking Mark and I were half-siblings. Leo couldn't stop laughing. "Sister-in-law, you were too cute back then." They all laughed, and I couldn't help but chuckle softly too. I looked back and saw Mark staring at me with a deep gaze. Noticing my gaze, he squeezed my hand tightly, turned his head without saying a word, and barely smiled for the rest of the night. Later, after parting ways with my best friend and the others, I went to get the car with Mark. We got to the parking lot, and he didn't rush to find the car. Instead, he turned and pulled me into a hug. I had already sensed his mood was off, and I had planned to ask him about it later. I wrapped my arms around his back and whispered, "What's wrong?" His hair was very soft, and he leaned down, rubbing his head in the crook of my neck, which tickled. After hugging for a long while, he finally said in a muffled voice, "Why didn't you tell me?" I froze. "Tell you what?" He was silent for a moment, then said, "That you thought I was your brother." I found it funny. What's there to tell? My brain just short-circuited back then, and see, I figured it out and came right back, didn't I? Mark hugged me even tighter. "Back then, were you very sad?" Of course I was sad back then. My boyfriend suddenly turned into my biological brother. My voice got quieter and quieter, then I suddenly realized, "Is that why you're upset tonight?" He didn't say anything more, just hugged me tightly in silence. He hugged me for a very long time, then he slowly said in a low voice, "Winter, my heart aches for you." I froze. Suddenly, I remembered something. That year, when I found out I wasn't my dad's biological daughter, Mark cried with me through the window. When I had cried enough and was tired, he had said the exact same thing. In the bustling crowd, only he stood there, wondering if I was sad.